Welcome back to this episode of our series on the British Museum and the Bible. I hope you have enjoyed our program so far. Join us again on this episode as we continue our conversations about history and the Bible.
We've been talking about the Bible up until this point. We've gone through certainly all the major three periods, Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian period. We've gone back to the book of Genesis. We've looked at the Abrahamic period, the Mosaic period. We've also hit the Davidic period. We've looked at that book, which is the revelation for Christianity. We also need to ask the same questions of any religious book that claims to be from God, including the religious book of the Muslims called the Quran. So we're going to ask the same question of the Quran. What do the manuscripts tell us? Can they be authenticated? Now, Muslims will say that the Quran was compiled by Zayd ibn Thabit in and around, during the Uthmanic period, around the mid-7th century, 650, about that time. The question we ask is, are there any originals? There's no reason why there should not be any originals, because that's very recent. We're talking basically 1400 years ago. The difficulty is we can't find any originals. Muslims will claim that there are two originals. They will claim that the Topkapi manuscript, which is found in Istanbul, there in Turkey, is one of the original Uthmanic recensions. They'll say also that the Tashkent manuscript, or the Samarkand manuscript found in Tashkent in Uzbekistan, would be a second of the original four manuscripts that was compiled at the time of Zayd ibn Thabit in the mid-7th century. So how are we going to know whether or not those are authentic or not? Well, one of the best things we can do is to find other manuscripts that corroborate. The problem is we can't find any other manuscripts. There are just none that exist in the 7th century. So what do? Well, the next best thing is to come to the coins. The reason why is the coins are pristine, they don't disintegrate, and we can look at the script on the coins and see how they evolve. Dr. Vinisha Porter has done a good job by putting the coins, the Arabic coins, in sequence on this panel here. I want you to take your notice up at the very top, the number 1 and 2. Those are Byzantine coins. And there you're looking at the Byzantine dinar. When you look at them, you will notice that they have an emperor on one side with two retainers on either side of him. And on the back side of the coin is a Byzantine cross. When the Arabs took over the commerce, when they took over that part of the world, they reproduced the same coins, number 3 and 4, just to the right. But you notice instead of an emperor, you will find the caliph with two of his retainers on either side. On the back side is not the Byzantine cross, though much of it is there. The cross piece has been taken off. Much the same coin, one for the Byzantines, the other for the Arabs. But notice and ask one question. Are Muslims permitted to put images on their coins? Are they permitted to have any images? The answer is absolutely no. So what are images doing on those coins? That's a curious question. As you come on down to number 9 and 12 below, you will see these are coins from Abd al-Malik from the late 7th century. Again, the images still exist as late as the 7th century. If you come up to the right here, you will see a larger coin that is a facsimile there. That's a picture of Abd al-Malik himself. He ruled from 685 to 705. 685 to 705, late 7th century. What is he doing with an image on his coin if this was considered to be anathema in Islam? What that suggests is that certainly this problem with iconoclasm did not exist at the beginning of Islam. It was something that was added on much later. Now that's a pretty difficult thing to say. If this theological reference to iconoclasm evolved, why should we doubt also that the manuscripts evolved? When you look at those coins, did you notice there are two coins that we see in that panoply of coins of the dinar, the dinar of the Byzantine dinar. You see the Byzantine emperor on those dinar. Next to it are the first dinars that have been coined or minted in around this, about 640, 642 during Umar's time. The first dinars that are minted by the Arabs. I say Arabs, and I'll say why later on. But take a look at those coins. They've taken off the Byzantine emperor and imposed the Arab caliph. There's a good example. They've got to keep the same coin, but they don't want any reference to the Byzantine emperor, so they put their own caliph on it. That is quite normal. So there's case after case after case that we can see this.
Censorship has been going on for
all the time.
many centuries.
You want to make sure that it's you that's on the coin. You want to make sure it's your God. You want to make sure it's your legacy that's left behind. You don't want any inferences or any interloping from other peoples, not only their gods, but their kings.
Thank you.
But let me just, before you head on, then you need to say, why is it the Bible doesn't do this? Yes. See, the Bible gives us the whole story, and that's the beauty of the Bible. it not only gives us the beauty of how God works with man, that relational aspect, it also shows us that the Bible can be trusted in these points. And then it also says, listen, there are times and periods where other gods were mentioned. So the Bible does talk about Baal. The Bible does talk about the Israelites who go off and actually squander that relationship with God. It admits it. There's no reference.
Even about the great men of Israel.
Exactly.
The great kings and fathers of faith. The Bible talks about the good, the bad, and the ugly.
It always leaves it in. I mean, the sins of David, the sin of Solomon, we leave those in there. And that's why I can trust the Bible, because even though it's embarrassing to the Israelites, and you would have thought that the Israelites, if it was based on oral tradition, they would have thrown this out. They would have sanitized this material. The fact that it's not sanitized, the fact that all these references, every sinful sin is recorded there and left for posterity, proves the accuracy not only of the detail, but also tells us that we're dealing with a whole different genre of literature, a literature that is interested in showing just how evil man is and how we need to come back to God.
You know that our Muslim friends often accuse the New Testament of having been corrupted. It's not reliable, it's been corrupted, the doctrine of tahrif in Arabic. As a specialist in this field, how do you respond to the charges that we hear often?
Well, it is an important question, Sasan, and it's primarily the New Testament that the Muslims are aiming at. They don't say too much about the Old Testament because there's an awful lot of agreement. There's not much reference in the Quran specifically that would really confront the Old Testament material outside of possibly Isaac and Ishmael. The controversy as to who Abraham was to sacrifice. It's the New Testament, and it's primarily the person of Jesus Christ. What we do with Jesus Christ in the New Testament versus what the Quran does. So let's really focus on that area. Now, whenever I'm asked this question, I usually respond with a question to myself. Let's just say that you're asking me right now.
I am the critic in this conversation.
You believe that the Quran has, the Quran believes, and also that Muslims believe that the New Testament has been corrupted. So I'll throw it right back in your lap and I'll ask you one real quick question. Where and when?
Well, I would say I don't know where, but before the time of Prophet Muhammad, sometime before the time of Prophet Muhammad, the Christians corrupted the Injil.
Okay, so before the 7th century.
Yes.
All right, if that is the case, then I would ask you to go back into your own Quran itself. As a Muslim, you'd have to go and you get your authority from the Quran. And I ask you, is there any place in your book, in the Quran, that suggests that there has been a corruption? Is there any place in the Quran that even mimics or even brings this as a problem or even warns the Muslims about this?
I would assume that probably the Quran has said many things about the corruption of the Bible.
Would have to, because if it's that important and there are so many contradictions between the Quran and the New Testament, somewhere along the line they would warn that. Now, there's no way we can just go through all the verses. Just let me give you about 5 verses right now that you can look at in your own time. Look at Surah 10, Ayah 94, Surah 21, Ayah 7. Both these say the same thing. They say, if you have any question, go to the people of the book. Go to the people of the Tawrat in the Injil. Surah 29, Ayah 46 is even better. It mentions that the Muslims are not to argue with the Christians. I use that one at Speaker's Corner. I love it. They're not to argue with me because I've been given the Tawrat of Moses and the Injil of Jesus Christ. Then in Surah 4, 136, that's a good one for Muslims because it says to the Muslims, go to those scriptures that have come before you, the Tawrat, in the Injil, for they are signs for you. Surah 5, Ayah 46 and 47, and also Ayah 68, tell me as a Christian to go back to my scriptures because they are signs for me. So there I'm giving you 5 references that you can go to in your Quran that stipulate that the earlier scriptures are to be trusted, you're to go to them. If you have questions, you're to read them, you're to let them help you understand your own scriptures. And then I'll ask any Muslim, and I've been challenging this for 25 years, I'll ask any Muslim to show me one verse in the Quran that says the earlier scriptures have been corrupted. You won't find it.
So the Quran, it seems, according to what you're saying, that is very positive about the Old and the New Testament, the Injil and the Torah.
Absolutely. It says, it gives authority to the Old Testament and it gives authority to the New Testament, what they would call the Injil.
Okay.
Now, so the problem exists, there's certainly no authority for that type of injunction, not only in the Quran, you won't find it in the Hadith or the Tafsir, or certainly you won't find it in the Sirah or the Tahriq. So the traditions don't speak about it as well. Now, there are debates that happen in the 7th and 8th century between Christians and Muslims. In the 7th, especially the 8th century, that suggested there may be a corruption of Scripture. But the the theology of early corruption of Scripture, that theology was not really initiated by Islam until the 11th century with a man named Ibn Hazm. Ibn Hazm is the first that really made it a theology of Islam. So it's a very late theology. And it seems to suggest, finally, when they got around to reading the Bible and reading the New Testament, when they saw all the contradictions there, they had to come up with this theology.
Well, can a Muslim friend say, okay, the Bible wasn't corrupted before the 7th century, at the time of Prophet Muhammad, it was corrupted after
that's where you have to go.
The coming of Islam.
And that's exactly what I would expect Muslims to do. And that's usually what they do. If it's not before, then it must have happened sometime after the 7th century. Now, if that was the case, then we as Christians are going to have to come up with some type of authority to support the fact that our Bible, or certainly our New Testament, has not changed since the 7th century. And we have a litany of proofs for that. Let's go through some of these proofs that we have. Let's take each one of them, and we'll go through about 8 or 9 of them. Let's take each one of them one at a time, and let's just see what they tell us concerning the authority of the New Testament. Now, let's talk about the dating. Let's go with the dating first, because Muslims will tell me that we don't know whether or not the 27 books of the New Testament could have been written in the 1st century. There are liberal scholars today that would say that many of the books of the New Testament would have had to have been written in the 2nd, 3rd, some say even as late as the 4th century. To me, that's incredible that we'd make that statement anymore. You need to ask, really, what's the best work that's been done on the dating of the New Testament? The difficulty is this: we don't have the originals. Now, the reason for that is very simple. The technology that exists today for writing paper or for using vellum or parchment didn't exist in the 1st century. There was no material that would have lasted 2,000 years that existed at that time. So the people at that time were dependent on papyrus. Papyrus are the leaves, those reeds that you find in Egypt. Egypt was where this was perfected, where they take those interlocking, those leaves and interlock them like this. They would dry them, they would stamp them, and they would create a sort of
a sheet of paper.
Not a paper, it would be a scroll, yes. Is what it would be. They'd be rolled up, and they would be very long. And it would be on this that they wrote with styluses. Now, the difficulty with papyrus is that it gets dry, and it starts to disintegrate. We will go to the library, and I want to just show you some pictures. Looking at the library, let's look at some of the fragments that we have today that are in existence in the British Library. Now look at those fragments, and you can see those fragments are very fragile. After about 200 years, this papyrus disintegrates. So almost everything, in fact, all the originals that we know of would have disintegrated long before now. They certainly wouldn't have lasted 2,000 years. That's not to say that some do last. I mean, we can give you an example of the Dead Sea Scrolls, found in 1947 in those caves above the Qumran community, where that little shepherd boy was throwing rocks up into the caves, and it all of a sudden a jar broke, and he went and climbed up to look and see what was in there, and he found these jars. As they took these jars out and looked at the manuscripts inside, they were papyrus, dating from the 2nd century BC to the 1st century AD, some even the 1st and 2nd century BC up into the 1st century AD. And when they started unrolling them, they realized that a lot of these were biblical text. Not all of them. Many of them were texts from the Qumran community, the Essene community.
Commentaries, instructions.
Yes, and some of them were quite heretical because the Essenes were not considered to be necessarily orthodox. And so many of their texts were there. And there were bits and pieces on almost every book of the Old Testament. There was the entire manuscript of the book of Isaiah, which was a great find because it supported the fact that the Isaiah from the Masoretic text that we have, that we use today for our authority, that's dated 914 AD, when they compared it with the Dead Sea Scroll, it was almost exactly the same text. For 1,000 years it had retained basically it's the same composition. Now, that's why we don't expect to find any of the originals. They would, unless they're kept away in caves like that, where they're untouched, no one knows that they're there, and they're in a cool environment under sea level, then it would make sense that those would be retained. That's not the case with most manuscripts. People touch them, people use them, they read them, they put them in churches, they read from them, they start to disintegrate. As they disintegrate, they quickly copy them over into another manuscript, and that then about every 100 to 150 years, they'd have to be copied over and over. So there are many schools, generations of text. So obviously the dating is a difficulty. What about the date when they were written? Let's get back to that earlier question. The best thing to do is to get a look at it from inside. Let's look at some interior evidence to help us with that. There's many ways you can date. Let me just use probably the best book to start the dating, and that's the most historical book we find in the New Testament, the book of Acts.
Acts of the Apostles.
The Acts of the Apostles is a historical book, and it does deal with places, names, events, and dates. Let's get more specific. Acts chapter 18, verse 12 is probably the best place to start. Here you have a reference to Gallo. So Gallo is a person who is a proconsul. It says Gallo, the proconsul. That has always been disputed by historians because Pliny, the great historian, writing in the end of the first century, beginning of the second century, refers to Gallo and gives a whole history of his life, never mentions him as a proconsul. And so the observation by historians is that whoever wrote the book of Acts did not know Gallo, got it wrong. More than likely, the books of the Acts was probably written in the second century, redacted back to the first century. That's why he got it wrong.
And the author didn't know what he was talking
exactly,
about.
Because he was writing too late. He just didn't understand. Pliny is much earlier. Closer to the event, you go with Pliny. That was until the Delphi inscription was uncovered. When they uncovered the Delphi inscription, they saw there in the reference there that Gallo, the proconsul, for 1 year, in 1 year alone, in 52 AD.
Wow.
Gives the time, proving that whoever wrote the book of Acts got it correct. Gallo was a proconsul for just 1 year. That's why Pliny didn't know about it. Proving then that whoever wrote the book of Acts had to have been living at that time, around 52 AD. Let's get more specific. There are many events in the book of Acts that are not recorded that happened to the early church that should be recorded. Like, for instance, the martyrdom of James in 62 AD, or the martyrdom of Paul in 64 AD, or the martyrdom of Peter in 65 AD, or the destruction of Jerusalem in 66 AD, I'm sorry, the insurrection by the Jews against the Romans in 66 AD, and the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. These had huge impact on the church. Why are they not included in the book of Acts?
A book that talks about the history
of the early church. Every one of these events had a huge impact on the early church. Why are they not included, do you think?
A good possibility is they were written before these things happened.
Absolutely. It proves to me that the book of Acts was finished before any of these events, which now gives us a window when the book of Acts was written. It had to be written after 52 AD to have referred to Gallo as a proconsul, and before 62 AD. Christ died in 33 AD, so within 20 to 25 years you have the book of Acts. Now, we also know that Luke was written by the author of the book of Acts.
The Gospel of Luke.
The Gospel of Luke before the book of Acts. So put Luke and Matthew would have been written about the same time period. Both Matthew and Luke would have been written before 52 AD. We know that Mark was written before that. So 3 of the Gospels were written within 20 years of Christ's death. All of Paul's letters were written within 15 to 20 years of Christ's death. That's not in doubt. We don't have time to get into show how he proof texts that. So you have 3 of the Gospels plus all the books of Paul, plus the book of Acts. John was written much later. He would have written about 70 or 80 AD. But the important thing is, take a look at what I've just told you. 3 of the Gospels, plus Acts, plus all of Paul's letters, written while the disciples were still living in Jerusalem. The disciples would not have been thrown out of Jerusalem until 70 AD. Now that's important, because that means every one of these synoptic Gospels, plus those written by Luke and Paul, were read by the disciples, those who were with Jesus, who were eyewitnesses to every one of these accounts. In fact, Luke was not an eyewitness. He wasn't there. He didn't know Jesus. He says that in the first 3 verses, right there in the first chapter of Luke. He says, "O Theophilus," and he says, "I have taken upon myself basically to write that which you have given me. Correct me if I'm wrong," is really what he's saying. This is for you. This is your account. I'm getting it from you. You tell me if this is really what happened. You tell me if this is really what he said. So he is asking, he's basically asking for corroboration. Now that gets me excited, because what that tells me is we can trust it. It was written while the people who knew Jesus Christ were still there, and not long after. It was written while they were all still in Jerusalem. So there, as far as the dating is concerned, I don't think anybody's in doubt that they are authoritative. The next question, of course, then goes into the manuscripts themselves. What manuscripts do we have?
Let me interrupt you for 1 second, Jay. I just wanted to tell our audience about Josh's book that has been translated, that we can trust.
Excellent.
The historicity of the book of Acts. We can trust that even secular historians, specialists of Roman history, are confirming that Luke is a trustworthy author of
Let's talk about that. Let me just go into Luke a little bit more. When you look and see what Luke says concerning Politarchs, for instance, he mentions that Politarchs were the civil authority in Thessalonica, the city of Thessalonica, in certainly Acts 17, verse 6. This has always been disputed by a lot of historians until they'd finding these inscription after inscriptions. About 19 inscriptions have now been uncovered, mentioning that politarchs were used as civil authorities. 5 of these inscriptions mention that these politarchs were found there in Thessalonica, supporting exactly what Luke was saying. He mentions also that a Philippian ruler is called praetor. Now this was disputed because the name that has been found in most inscriptions is demure. And of course people said, how could somebody make such a large mistake like that? What we now know is actually the earlier name for a civil ruler is praetor. Demure came much later by the Romans. So actually it now supports not only that Luke could be the author of this, but also supports that Luke would have to be an early authorship, not a later one. Otherwise he would have used demure. We always gave the reference to Gallo as a proconsul. Earlier we talked about that, and I think that's been a terrific one to really stipulate that Luke is not only as more accurate than Pliny, the historian, but it also dates his writing to around 52, between 52 and 62 AD. That means within 20 to 25, possibly as late as 30 years after Christ's death, if Christ died at 33 AD. Let me give you one other example. Luke uses the word Quirinius for the governor of Syria. And this was disputed because if he was the governor of Syria at the time of Jesus' birth, that would knock him off about anywhere from 4 to 10 years wrong. We found an inscription has now been found in Antioch, which supports exactly that it would, with this case, that Quirinius would have been the governor in Syria at the time of Jesus' birth. So it's these artifacts that have been uncovered now in the last century and a half that support not only the historicity of the book of Acts, but also the authorship of Luke, and also the fact that it is a very early writing from within the 1st century. F.F. Bruce gives us a great quote, and let me just read this quote that F.F. Bruce does, because he's probably the greatest authority that we have today on the earliest 200 manuscripts that we have of the New Testament. He says this: where Luke has been suspected of inaccuracy, and accuracy has been vindicated by some inscriptural evidence, it may be legitimate to say that archaeology has confirmed the New Testament record. So, who am I to quibble? If F.F. Bruce has come to this conclusion, I do as well. Okay,
so you have persuaded us to accept that we have eyewitness authors who have proven themselves to be accurate as far as we can check them on their historical statements. But how can we show that they have been accurately copied?
Okay, let's get into the manuscript itself, because that's the next area that we need to hit. Manuscript evidence will always be a difficulty because we don't have, as I said earlier, we don't have the originals because of the technology that existed. It wasn't until the 4th century that vellum or parchments were invented. The technology of taking animal skins, curing them, drying them, and using them as a means to write on. That was in the 4th century. So we would not expect to find anything that durable before the 4th century. There is the difficulty. How many manuscripts are we talking about? Now, if you look at all the manuscripts together, you have about 24,000 manuscripts of the New Testament, about a good 5,600 Greek manuscripts. You have about 10,000 Latin Vulgates, and about another 9,000 in other languages. In fact, we're going to find out about as many as 11 different languages. They are not all early, though. There's only about 230 of them that are dated before the 7th century. That means dated before the Quran. And it is these 230 that we're looking at the most specifically. F.F. Bruce spends his whole career on these 230 manuscripts because they are the most authoritative, because they're closest to the event. And it's when you look at those that you start to realize that there is an enormous amount of corroboration. Which ones are we talking about? Well, you're talking about the John Rylands manuscript, which is right up here in England, in Manchester, which is portions of the book of John from the 2nd century, or the Bodmer Papyrus in Switzerland. Again, portions of the book of John from the 2nd century. If you go across the waters to Ireland, to Dublin, you'll find the Chester Beatty manuscripts. Those are portions, and sometimes very large portions, of all 4 of the Gospels, plus the book of Acts, and plus the book of Revelation from the 3rd century. Then we're going to now go and we're going to show you some manuscripts that we have right here in London. And these are the most exciting. Come with me now as we go back to the British Library. Let's go to the Ridback Gallery. This is a very important place. The British Library is probably the greatest treasure trove we have for ancient manuscripts, including the Bible. Let's go and see what we can find there in the Ridback Gallery in the British Library.
Our time has come to an end again, but I will promise you we will continue these discussions in the next program. See you next time.